Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Interop 2021. I am your host, Bryan Culver from Network to Code, hosting a panel discussion on developing a culture for network automation. My panelists here have worked for many years through networking, and now working on instilling a culture for network automation in their businesses today. My co-host panelists are Ivan, Mike, and Joe. Without further ado, Ivan, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Ivan Pepelnjak, network architect at IPSpace.net, automating networks since 1990.
Mike?
I'm Mike Bushong. I run data center at Juniper. I've been working in the automation space since probably 2006.
Thank you, Mike. And Joe?
Thank you, Bryan. My name's Joe Eldridge. I'm an engineering manager at Riot Games, managing the Riot Global Backbone.
Thank you all for that. So without further ado, let's get with the first question. Do you agree that network automation is a journey and a culture rather than a specific technology or tech stack? Let's go with Mike first.
Sure. So I'm on the vendor side. I wish desperately it was just a tech stack, because then I could go and build whatever people want. You go and you sell it and you make a killing. The truth is, it doesn't matter what the technology is. I think there's pros and cons to everything. What I see is, generally it's about skills. There's a cultural element. It's about how do you think about change management. It's a philosophical discussion about how you even interact with the devices and the network in general. It's so much more than the technology. So I think companies that really want to move down the automation path, it really starts with thinking more about your people than it does about what products you want to buy or open source software you want to download.
And what would you say for coming from the vendor perspective, wanting it to be a piece of technology you can grab right off the shelf and here's your network automation? What role would you say the vendor can have in not only just delivering tools that ultimately will be built into the solution, but developing that culture?
I think, education is a big part of it. I think there's a kind of this industry-wide meme that automation is going to remove a bunch of jobs. And I think that, a lot of the people who talk about that and who are anchored to some, huge OpEx argument and pitching that in the industry are actually doing the entire industry a pretty big disservice. I think there's elements of contextualization. So even if you have an off-the-shelf piece of software, there's an automation last mile that has to be solved. And so there's, elements of support and service that can really help people get started. I think it's about even things like packaging. You got to think through a little bit, like what is it people actually need? How do you help them? How do you handle things like upgrades? This isn't like you sell some piece of software and then they don't touch it. The operations is the core of what people do, and that means you've got to be more involved than just drive by, sell a piece of software and then come back for renewals a year later. It's a much deeper engagement. You've got to be intimately familiar with the process. You got to be intimately familiar with kind of the cadence and the rhythm of the business. I think it's much deeper than just a piece of software or a product that you're going to sell.
Okay. Wonderful answer. Ivan?
Yeah, well, absolutely agree with everything that Mike said. It's definitely mostly a culture, because if you want to automate something, you have to define what you're doing first. There are no one-offs anymore. There are no special requests for special customers who will bring the sales guy the bonus for this year. We don't do that anymore. We can't, because if you want to automate, you have to be consistent. If you want to be consistent, you can't have one-offs. And that's the big problem that most of the potential users of network automation are facing today. They're either not willing or not capable or not ready to say no when the sales guy comes along saying, we need this special deal for this one customer, or for this one application, or for this one user, or for whatever.
Now, Joe, coming from the more customer side than say the vendor side, do you feel that you're capable with external resources and vendor resources to develop that culture inside your own company, or is there certain things that you need more tooling and tech stack for network automation?
No, I think that, and again, I think Mike answered it beautifully from his vendor perspective. I think as a customer, it's not about tech stack. It's not engineering's math. You can get to 4 in a million different ways, 2 + 2, 5 - 1. We're all going to get there on our own way, and trying to bring in a piece of tech or something off the shelf just never really fits right. And you have to do wonky things to get there. What you need to do, and a pithy answer, is build inclusion. I think that as infrastructure folks, being in networking for so long, we've always thought about, like Yvonne said, this is the process in which I do something. Now you write code to go and do the thing that I've done a million times manually. I think in order to push us forward into better automation, we need to start bringing in software developers who have a completely different mindset. And instead of saying, hey, go write me a Python script or a C# script, say, here's the outcome I want, and talk me through how we can achieve this outcome. And I think that's what's going to push us forward, both from a culture perspective and from a technology perspective.
It's beautiful actual segue to my next point that I wanted to ask you guys about. There's a multifaceted aspect of network automation. I mean, it's an entire world of essentially applying a lot of practices that came from the software engineering space into the network engineering space. But because it's such a myriad of options that your team could start, getting research in and having to learn these tools and aspects and concepts. I'll start back with you, Joe, is, what are you finding with the more network engineering side of the house is coming up on network automation? What are concepts that you guys are finding to be most pivotal to learn first? Is it SDLC? Is it intent versus observed state, config, sources of truth? What are you guys finding that is providing a lot of value?
I think if I understand the question, Bryan, I think for us, the biggest thing that we're struggling with is uniformity, trying to get the idea of how do we get the world to a place where when we try and automate, everything is like for like across the network. And that's kind of the linchpin in what we're doing. One of the things I go back to that I'm striving for is trying to flip the script on our approach. Today, we've got a lot of very talented engineers who are writing some really good Python use cases for one-offs, but we're not thinking about how do we make this extensible so I can reuse it? How do we incorporate CI/CD? Like how do we make this a scalable solution and not a one-use solution? And I think if I'm answering your question, and please correct me if I'm not, those are the gaps we really have.
No, that's perfect because it really kind of clues into one of that next detail with back to Ivan's point, there are no snowflakes anymore, but with people building network automation, it's not an off-the-shelf product. We are slowly getting back into, similar snowflakes where your data models in one environment look significantly different than another organization. So for an engineer to go from one job to the next, they are having to relearn how one company decided to go through on their network automation journey. So, back to your point, Ivan, how do you curb the overgrowth of the snowflake and trying to maintain industry best practices instead of coming up with a really novel, not even novel, just like, crazy implementation of something?
Well, the same way that everyone else is in IT is doing that. There are some people who do that better. There are some people who do it worse. Every company has a different way of calculating salaries. And in the end, people are just paid by the end of the week or the end of the month. And yet the programmers doing that are all using more or less the same tools, the same approaches, the same databases. It's just that the formula to calculate the salary is different. And it's the same thing here. I mean, we're all using the same tools, the same approaches, the same methods, apart from some people who have to be special, but let's leave them there. But we are all using different data models because, my network, someone in my house thinks that my network is unique because it routes IP. And so the data model has to be this way. And over the road, there is some other company and they think their network is unique because they route IP. And so they use this other data model. But that doesn't matter. Because in the end, if you're a programmer going from one company writing accounting software to another company writing accounting software, the database schema will be different. So you will have to grasp with that anyway. It's all over the industry. We have never standardized on a database schema ever, anywhere in the industry.
And I'll segue to Mike in a second, but it's interesting to think that there ultimately is, this interoperability, Juniper versus Cisco versus, any other, you name the vendor, the way you configure their devices are different, but they all have to route the same level of traffic, the same type of traffic, if you will.
Yeah, but it's the same with databases. No two databases use the same SQL commands to create a table.
Right.
And they've been trying to do that for the last 50 plus years, and they still haven't got to a point where I could just take something that works with MySQL and deploy it on Oracle and move on. So why do we expect the networking vendors to get it right?
Exactly. Now, segue to Mike, I think one thing that I do want, we have, different customer perspective. Are you seeing some commonality with customers coming to you and say they all need to automate almost the same situation? They all think that they're snowflakes, but when you get down to the nitty gritty detail, it's the same question and the same ask.
Yeah, everybody thinks they're different. I've talked to probably 1,000 customers over the last, say, 6 or 7 years. Almost all of those conversations are about operations in some way, right? Usually automation. It's the same basic ideas, right? What everyone's looking to do is they want to automate. There's a huge bifurcation between the folks at the top end who are like really clueful about what they're doing. They think in terms of workflows. Everyone else, they don't even know what they want to automate. They don't know where to start. And so I see, no matter what the context is, no matter what they're doing in their network, they have the same basic obstacles. I used to ask a question, like, what do you want to automate? I work at a networking company. So almost invariably, they come back and they say, we want to automate the network. And the challenge is that the network is a noun. You can't automate nouns, you automate verbs. And if you don't understand what the verbs are in your environment, then you can't even get started. And then on top of that, everyone has the same basic perspective, which is it's about keystroke removal. There's a task that used to take 5,000 keystrokes. They want to write a script so that it can take 3 keystrokes, and then they think that that's kind of the pinnacle of automation. They're just kind of starting in the wrong places. That it doesn't matter what the steps are. I don't think that the specific workflow changes the culture. It changes what you implement and the tools that you might integrate. But I think having like a solid understanding of what are the verbs in the network, like that's where I would start. And I know that's somewhat depressing for a bunch of automation enthusiasts, but that's the actual problem people have. And you have to wonder, like I take OpenStack as an example, right? The pinnacle of OpenStack at one point was like ML2, right? You put in tens of thousands of person hours into that, and you come back with like VLAN provisioning. I mean, there's got to be more to that. Like we have to be looking beyond, the basic ubiquitous workflows that we think, to Yvonne's point, there are not going to be that many things that are common across every environment. And so searching for those and having the vendors chase those as an example, it's just not a useful thing to do. So I couldn't agree more with, the uniformity comment that Joe made. That's, in my mind, you got to be uniform in your environment, but you got to recognize that every environment's going to be somewhat contextual. And so the question is like, where do you start and how do you go from there?
Yeah. And then, so now that, for a lot of companies, especially, mid-sized companies that, are going to be walking into network automation, a lot of times they're going to be seeking the rite of passage, or the right way from their vendor. They're going to say to their vendor, we're having a lot of, difficulties with this. So they're going to commonly come to you first. They may have people that are aware of this idea from, Hacker News, other, places that are talking about all of these concepts now, podcasts, blogs. If every customer that came to you saying, we want to automate our network, if you could point them to not only the concept of what are the verbs that you're trying to automate, not the nouns that you're trying to automate, but what are some foundational technology concepts that you are encouraging these companies to get up to speed on before they really go headlong into the automation journey?
I think it somewhat depends on where they start. I think if you believe it's about the verbs, then being conversant in workflow is particularly important. I think that the specific tools that people use tend to be entry points into different workflows, and that'll tend to drive how you think about pulling different things together. I think you got to think about the domain a bit. If all you're doing is working within like a set of switches or a set of routers, I think that the number of workflows that you'll have access to that are really difference making is quite a bit different. Once you realize that you have to work across domain, things like data distribution are important. You got to normalize things. Yvonne talked about the database problems, and it's the same idea. You take a MAC address. How many different ways could different vendors handle MAC addresses? And it turns out that it's frightfully inconsistent. And so you got to think through, like, what does normalization look like? You've got to change the point of interaction, so people have to get comfortable moving off the CLI and interacting at a different level. There's certain things around API discipline, and then you get into source code repositories and things like versioning, which are foreign to a lot of network engineers who have been brought up in a CCIE type world where you learn the commands through rote memorization and then you go and execute those. There's like really basic foundational like elements. If you really want things to be reusable, even the idea of like designing for reuse, that seems like a silly concept, for folks who kind of know what they're doing. But like, that's a pretty big deal, because how you design is very, very different. The levels of abstraction that you use are quite different. This gets back into like proper, automation architecture, not just, writing some script and learning a language. I think these gentlemen will have more to say on that. I think they're a little smarter than I am in the space.
So I'll pose the question, similar question to Ivan and Joe is, coming from a background with, knowing and working with network engineers, what are, maybe we'll switch a little bit over more to the culture side, is the way we work in classical network engineering. There was obviously a big, broad project of building out a new data center, or even if you're in the telephony space, doing service orders, adding and removing customers and whatnot. Going into network automation is obviously significantly different. Are you guys finding that their team structures are different? Are you finding that the way teams do reviews? I remember, slinging cable, I never had a Scrum stand-up before. Now this is something that, we're having to do agile practices. These are beyond just the scope of technical culture, but more of like a people culture type of perspective. Are you guys finding, hurdles or challenges or unique perspectives in those directions? I'll start with Joe.
So yes, there are a lot of challenges. First, I want to say, Mike, I'm going to shamelessly steal using verbs instead of nouns. I love that phrase, and I'm going to shamelessly steal that as much as I can to answer the question. I feel like a lot of the infrastructure folks, not just networking, are still grounded in, I understand a task and I'm going to automate the thing that I do. A lot of what we do is still very waterfall. I need to build a data center. There's no agile way to add infrastructure. I can't add a router and wait for the rack to arrive. It just doesn't work. And so I feel like we struggle more with trying to adapt the company to waterfall where we can and agile where we can, and getting them to understand the differences than really struggling with agile in itself. Agile is great for us and how we operate. We run Kanban when we can. And so the engineers love that because they feel empowered. I want to touch back on something Mike said off topic a little bit. Mike talked about we want to operate our networks and reduce toil. And I think that's the key for me. When I talk to the engineers about automation, it's not automation because there's work they don't want to do. It's automation so we can get toil out of the way and tackle the fun and interesting problems. Nobody wants to do a network upgrade 3 times a year and manually walk through that. So how do we make that process better? We can't fully automate it, but how do we make it better so that we have more time to play on fun problems? That kind of answers your question in a very roundabout way, Bryan. I'm sorry.
No, take any direction that you needed to get there. And I think that's a perfect answer, because it kind of alludes me to my next question, which is, being aware of you can't automate everything. And probably on a lot of automation projects, they tackle the piece of fruit that is extremely small at the very, very high top, part of the tree. And it may not be worthwhile, and not being retrospective enough to say, we're plucking these activities day in and day out. Is there a way that we could actually automate that? So beyond just the verb, Ivan, maybe you have some perspective. How do you get teams to be aware of It doesn't sound like a very interesting automation challenge. It may not even be a very complex challenge, but it's 80% of your workload. And if you could drive it down to 20%, it opens your door to so many other opportunities.
Yeah, well, to rephrase your question, it's not sexy enough. You can't brag about it.
Perfect. Yes.
Yes, that's what I'm always telling students in my automation course. Start with, the low-hanging fruit. Whatever is simple enough so that you can tackle it immediately, that you don't need a big data model behind it, that you don't need a huge database behind it. Whatever is simple enough that you could automate, and it could be troubleshooting. It could be data gathering. I mean, there are network management systems that can't show you transceiver levels. So how do you know when your links are failing? That's a perfect automation job. Log into all the boxes, do show commands, parse data, create an HTML file with red, orange, yellow, green. And now you know what your link status is. Some people go into graphing. There was someone that created a graph of the multicast tree for a particular multicast group in his data center. They spent days troubleshooting multicast issues, and usually it took them hours to find why a particular multicast group wasn't working. With this, they run the script. 5 minutes later, they have a graph, and now they can start chasing the problem down the graph. There are people who would verify wiring plans. Is my data center wired correctly? There was even one who was tasked with a crazy idea. They had a huge power outage, and the manager wanted to know whether all the UPSs survived. So what do? You log into all the devices and you do show version to see the uptime. Is the uptime, longer than when the power outage was? And someone had the great idea to do this manually. And this guy said, no, I'll automate that. He was the hero of the day, and it's a trivial idea. Mm-hmm. So there are so many trivial things that you are doing manually today that you could do with simple read-only access. You don't even need streaming telemetry. You don't need anything else but access to show commands. And it saves a huge amount of repetitive work. And I'm positive that every single organization has something like that. You just have to look around a little bit.
It did a great job of segueing into my next point as well, or my next question, which was the bootstrapper projects, things that have enough meat on them and common enough in all of our past experiences that we could say, if you start with this, you're going to get a roughly good understanding of some of the core concepts with network automation. I mean, you've already touched on several of those. I mean, we could, if I asked the audience, including the people that are watching this today, to raise their hands of the number of times that they have managed IPSpace in an Excel spreadsheet, I'm pretty much going to guarantee you every single person is going to be raising their hand. Now, does that mean necessarily that putting your IP address spacing into an actual tool or an application? There's open source, there's closed source, there's very expensive, free different solutions that we could all do to automate that. But maybe that's not the right Bootstrap project. So I'm going to start with you, Joe, and say, is there any project that you can think of that you've seen that seems general enough for most organizations that are attending today and have been listening, but they're still doing everything manually, that you could say, try this, go look at this?
The short answer is no. I don't think so, because everyone's network is so unique and special, but I feel that that's kind of a cop-out answer. So to not just give a cop-out answer, I think that a great place to start, kind of tying off on Ivan's example, creating some basic automation that allows you to pull the network for various information, being able to push a show command, be it interfaces, be it version, be it software, be it MAC addresses, is a great lead into the future where you want to be, because we all get those questions, be it from finance on, hey, we need to know how many of X widgets we have, or from a vendor, hey, you need to upgrade to the latest code. How many boxes are on Y version? And so you can find a lot of use cases out of a simple, let me generically show something across the network. But I think that is just a very basic step into what we really are striving for, which is finding a way to reduce our toil so that I go back to so that we can work on the fun things.
Yeah. And while I will say that it seems like a cop-out answer, I actually personally think it's a very good answer, because that is, that starts people with understanding how to collect data, parse it, and find find the value, find the useful information in this big stream of data. I will add to that is possibly sharing that with your team. That you can add layers on top of this. So that's where I see it as a journey. Is that you started with Ivan's example of just pulling this information out. If you're the only engineer on the team that can do it, how do you get that to be sourced by the ops people? How do you get that to be run on a dashboard? Mike, what are you seeing? What are some good Bootstrap projects that people can start into?
I actually agree. I think that whenever an issue shows up, some syslog event, the first thing you do is you scramble and try to get a bunch of information out and show commands. Starting with that, which gets you a little bit into event-driven stuff. It's when this happens, then execute these commands. It's a pretty easy step to go from that to automated ticket opening. We talk to a lot of folks with ServiceNow or Atlassian or whatever. How do you get the output of those show commands into a ticket just so it can be triaged? Because it's a different person that has to go and look at it. And given that a lot of issues, if it's a persistent issue, those are fairly easy to troubleshoot. It's always there. The transient things where it's like a moment in time, like getting some discipline around that, it's a good place to start. It forces you to think through what are the workflows that are associated with troubleshooting a particular thing. So it actually kind of gets you already thinking about the verbs on the network instead of just the nouns. And so that's where I see most of our customers starting.
Perfect. And I'll one last question, and it's going to be the hesitant audience members that are saying network automation sounds scary. It sounds like I'm going to take down my whole network. What is a useful, exactly, I don't think so either. But what is there's a word of caution. Like there's always horror stories that we all have to say, this one time the automation, there was this bug and it took down the network. We've seen those news bulletins go out numerous times, from the biggest companies to the smallest companies. So to put people that are hesitant to network automation at ease, what is one thing that you could say as a word of wise, as a word of caution, or a perspective for network automation to say, this is worth the potential risk that you think, even though it may not be there? Ivan.
Well, you started this with it's a journey. Mm-hmm. And yes, it's a journey. Start with read-only stuff. And every decent network device today has some role-based access control where you can limit what a particular username can do. So you can limit the automation user to do show commands. The worst that can happen is that it executes too many show commands. And if that crashes the device, please switch the vendor. Then the next thing is you may want to start playing with the configs. And instead of just pushing the configs out, you create the proposed changes and then you have someone review them before they are pushed out. And then they're pushed out in the maintenance window. And the next thing you do, you may still keep reviewing them, but you push them out in production during the day if the changes are limited to what works. And then after a few months or maybe even years doing it this way, you're confident enough that you go like, well, these 3 procedures have been tested enough that we can just do them in production, with no guardrails, whereas anything else still has to be reviewed and approved, and you slowly grow that.
Perfect answer. Joe, would you add anything on top of that?
I don't know that I can. I think he is absolutely right. It'd start with a role account that only has unprivileged access, and get comfortable. Like I think it's a journey to Ivan's point. I think he's got it perfect.
100%.
So the companies that, especially, I've been in places before, we didn't really have a lab environment, and virtualization is thankfully a more newer and well adopted set up nowadays. How do you go to some of these bigger problem solves with you when you may not necessarily have the budget for an on-prem lab or a hosted lab? Any thoughts there to say this next hurdle, we're going to give it write access. How do we validate this before we actually turn it on to actually do production provisioning?
Well, yet again, if you structure things correctly, you don't need to emulate every device in the network. Mm-hmm. After all, the software developers writing banking software don't have to emulate every customer the bank has. Mm-hmm. They just have to emulate the sample transactions. Yeah. The same thing here. You have to have, the good enough representation of your network, the core switches, the access switches, the WAN edge routers, a few other things. And that may be, 10 devices. And running 10 virtualized devices, I can do that on my Intel NUC. So come on.
Yeah. So Joe, people that you work with day to day, when they come to you, I'm sure you ask them, have you tested this? Have you validated this? How have you done that? What are the things that you're looking for to say, nope, this change or this automation looks good. We can start using this right now.
So I don't ever think I've said this change looks good because I'm a nervous Nelly. But to answer your question, the approach we've taken, not where I am today, because I think we're way farther along than the risk averse automation where I started in the industry. But when I started, the things that we would do is put a text file on a Linux box. Logging into a router is largely no different than editing a file on any server. Mm-hmm. And so you write automation to change a config. Configs are just text files that routers read, right? So you copy one down, you put it on a server, and you interact with it. And when you can interact with it and see the results you want, that gives you a level of comfort that you can make a change. The trick that I have found, or the challenge I have found, is with routing, the problem almost is never on the device you are changing. It is on somewhere in the receiving end. You change a peer and untoward, you get routes in a location you weren't expecting routes. And there's no way to test that in a production environment. And there's no way to test that in a lab. You can only make sure that the change that you're instituting has good connectivity. And the biggest thing I would tell all of the other nervous people out there that are like me is console access is a great thing. And if you have console access, you could kind of de-risk some problems by finding another way in.
Perfect. Mike, any final thoughts?
No, I think it's super pragmatic. Start slow, move at the pace you're comfortable. I think we have to demystify some of this stuff. It's not magic. And any network engineer who thinks that this is this is development and they're not a developer, just do a show config on whatever vendor you have and tell me that you're not already working in code. Yeah. I mean, everything's nested. It's super complex. Thousands and thousands of lines that have to be maintained over distributed systems. Network developers or network engineers largely have the skills. What they have to do now is develop the comfort and the confidence. And if you do that, I think the tools are there to help.
Realizing that the pipe command is actually a form of programming and filtering data is probably one of the biggest mind blowers I've given to any network engineers. Like, no, you're this right here to copy this in Python. That's all you have to do right there. And they're like, are you kidding me? I can just dump that in here. So, well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today. Thank you all for taking a view at our panel discussion. I hope this excites you and helps give you some guiding principles for developing network automation culture in your organization. So I think all of us can be reached. I think all of our communication details are inside of the Interop page. So feel free to reach out to any one of us if you have any questions.